Good evening, everybody. Welcome back. It's been a couple week hiatus, as we usually do over the Jewish holiday time. So welcome back to another episode of Mondays with Moshe. This is Maishi Norman out in Lakewood, New Jersey, far on the East Coast. It's 9:01. We're going to get started with our latest topic. I've been thinking, Mondays with Moshe is going on just about 3 years. We're hitting the 3-year mark, I think, in a few weeks. So that's a really unfathomable goal. I mean, we hadn't really planned. This was very unplanned, very spontaneous, how this show Zoom cast call began. For those of you who are here since its inception, and for those of you who need some history, just very briefly, it began on a WhatsApp chat group. We were having a dialogue among some mental health professionals that sort of spiraled into a heated debate. And it was really about content-based therapy versus process-based therapy, and what is psychotherapy. And this has been really at the forefront of the mission of Mondays with Maishi. It's really been to bring more attention and focus to the process of therapy. There's so much going on and training in the way of content and content-based kind of therapy, of sort of concrete therapy. And my mission was really to bring more focus and attention to the process that goes on within the psychotherapeutic relationship in the room and all of that. So that's really what we've focused on mainly over the past few years. Recently, in the past few months, we focused a little bit more on psychopathology, such as DID, aka multiple personalities, some other psychopathology that's come along over time, psychosis and schizophrenia. And we've had some really fascinating presenters and experts on these topics. But again, the passion has always been to focus on the process of psychotherapy. That's when, we had some of our greatest shows on process-based work. And I think that going into year 3, I might consider doing some more recordings or discussions that address potentially psychopathology or other modalities of therapy that might be different than some of the things we've done in the past, just to broaden a little bit. If anybody wants process-based work, we've covered so much of it that they have 3 years. I haven't counted the episodes, but probably close to 100 episodes worth of process-based work. So for those of you who are interested, of course, you may go on. We now have most of the shows on YouTube. The handle is Mondays with Moshe. So if you go into YouTube and you check out Mondays with Moshe, you can see many of our process-based discussions. Of course, for those of you who are still receiving the emails, the weekly flyer and the email, if you go on to the bottom of that email, there's a link where you can reach our Google Drive. And in that Google Drive, you'll find pretty much all of the previous episodes. So maybe we'll start something a little different for the coming year, for year 4 of Mondays with Maishi. I also do want to announce that Mondays with Maishi is now sponsored by okclarity.com. The reason is because I now have my very own okclarity.com profile. What is okclarity.com? For those of you who are wondering, okclarity.com is a website that promotes your practice so that you don't have to do it yourself. We know how mental health professionals are kind of not in the field of self-promotion and marketing and advertising and at the business end of things. So if you go into okclarity.com, you can actually create your own profile. You can put up your own messages. You can make your own videos, etc. It's definitely worth checking out. And it's probably something that, of course, if you present yourself well, you can use to maximize your business and grow your practice. I want to give a special thank you to tonight's feature presenter, Dovid Becker, who is a licensed clinical social worker, actually here in Lakewood, right down the road. So an old friend and buddy and colleague with whom I've spent plenty of time consulting with and chatting with and discussing things with. And of course, as a friend and a confidant and a peer. So Dovid, thank you for agreeing to come on, share some of your expertise. Tonight's topic is the process of treating attention deficit. Shoot, I forgot what the rest stands for. Is it attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD? Okay, so David, tell us a little bit about who you are. I know you're a licensed clinical social worker, but how did you fall into this area of expertise of ADHD? What's some of your clinical background and trainings that we should know about that are relevant for tonight's conversation?
Okay, awesome. Thanks. First of all, hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm honored that there are people here. I'm interested in full disclosure. I've known Maishi for quite some time, since we carpooled back in kindergarten, and ever since. I wonder if there's any anxiety specialists out there could use it. This is a pretty big stage, and I'm not sure how I landed here. Other than that, maybe you confused Beck with Becker. But regardless, I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to talk about anxiety, I don't know, you want to hear about my background, how I got here. So my name is Dovid Becker. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in private practice here in Lakewood. I also have the amazing opportunity to direct the men's social work program at the Wurzweiler School of Social Work, the Sarah Schneer Partnership. So we have a lot of students and alumni here. So guys, thank you for coming. I'm honored and intimidated by your presence. I don't know, I became a therapist. I started treating, I was doing a lot of anxiety, OCD, oppositional defiant disorder, and along the way, I discovered that I seemed to know a lot about ADHD myself. So I started learning more and more about ADHD, and eventually started meeting people with ADHD, and then it kind of took over. I went into the state of hyperfocus, which hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about. And since then, that's about about all that I've been doing, and had the great opportunity to meet lots of great clinicians, therapists, thought leaders in the ADHD world, and really I'm still learning, still growing, still developing, and awesome to be here.
Oh, that's great. Okay, thank you for that. I do want to encourage all of you, for those of you who have questions on ADHD related topics, or have any questions for Dovid Becker, please, I'm going to ask you, I see there's many new people on tonight. The protocol is to use the reactions tab on the bottom right of your screen. Click, raise your hand, and I will call on you when we have a moment to do so. For those of you who might not be subscribed to Mondays with Maishi, I'd like to say shame on you, but I understand that there's other reasons that people might not be subscribed. Please send me an email after the show or during the show, and I will subscribe you. This has been a phenomenal journey, and we have more up and coming exciting people to present. So there's a lot to learn here. And for those of you who've been long time subscribers, I'm sure you've learned a lot. Also want to give a special shout out to Mattis Miller. David, I don't know if there's any plug or anything you want to comment or mention here, but Mattis is a previous two-time presenter on Mondays with Maishi. So thanks, Mattis. It's great to have you. And I'm sure David is very honored.
Yeah, it's awesome to have Mattis on board. We're actually collaborating together to open an IOP here in Lakewood that will hopefully bring a higher level of care, really a higher level of care, for those who need it, to this community, to this area. So that's really exciting, and also just exciting hang around Mattis. That's really fun. And my sneaky plan is to use it as a little bit of a platform to promote more ADHD awareness and treatment opportunities, et cetera.
Excellent. I mean, this is great.
He doesn't know about that yet. So
for those of you who have clientele in Lakewood, this is a great opportunity, and I know so because I know both David and Mattis, and this is going to be a great platform and a great place, a very safe and successful intensive outpatient place. So let's get started on our talk on ADHD. Got it. Okay.
By the end of tonight, you'll have it. Don't worry.
All right. So I want to start with a question of it, just very fundamental. ADD, ADHD, there's been a lot of confusion from different versions of DSM for people like me who still only have the DSM-4 and the DSM-5. What happened to what people used to call ADD, and what's the difference between the two?
Okay, so awesome question, and a great point of confusion for lots of people. ADD stands for attention deficit disorder. That's what it used to be. There was ADD and ADHD, and nobody knew what they had, and everyone was all confused. So the great minds at the DSM came up with this amazing new concept called ADHD, where everyone just has the same thing, except we break it down into 3 subtypes. So there are actually 3 subtypes of ADHD, and there's a slash in there somewhere. I never remember where to put it, but there is a slash, and it's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And you could have one of three types. It could be inattentive, hyperactive, or combined. So I'll get into that in a minute. I would just say just a very interesting thing that I've noticed over time is in the clinical world, ADHD seems to be, it's deceptively easy and simple. Meaning it's almost like, okay, so I'm treating someone with anxiety, or I'm treating a couple with a relationship issue, and pops up that one of them is ADHD, and it's almost like, okay, get some medication and then come back and let's get back to the couple's work. And there's sometimes a fundamental misunderstanding of what ADHD is and how deep the impact of ADHD is on emotional health, on executive function, on relationships, on marriage, on job performance, etc. There was actually a reverse comorbidity study that was done where they kind of looked at it backwards. They said, let's look at some major disorders and try to figure out how many of those people carry a co-occurring diagnosis of ADHD. So this was in 2006, a Kessler study. Major depression, they found that 9.4% of patients had a co-occurring disorder of ADHD. Dysthymia was 22.6%, bipolar was 21%, generalized anxiety disorder was 11%, active substance abuse was 10%. That means if anyone, any therapist in any setting has at least 10 clients, one of them, by a conservative estimate, will be diagnosed with ADHD or have a co-occurring diagnosis that they may have missed. So I feel like it's it's important to really get a sense and understanding of the differences and nuances. And am I looking at ADHD? Is it possible that ADHD is in play here, and that's impacting the diagnosis? Did I answer your question?
Very important. Yeah, that's a really important point. So what I'm hearing you say is that they knocked out the ADD diagnosis, replaced it with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, inattentive.
Right. Inattentive. Well, you can either be inattentive. So inattentive are those like with poor listening skills. They lose things, they misplace things, get sidetracked, get distracted easily. Their attention span is diminished, etc. That's inattentive. Mm-hmm. Hyperactive and impulsive are the more common symptoms. When we think of ADHD,
the more obvious symptoms. You mean
the more, right? Yeah, or the more the symptoms that we relate to more. But when you think of ADHD, in classic, what pops into people's head are people who are climbing the walls, who are all over the place, who can't sit still, who are fidgeting, who are impulsive, or blurting things out, or calling out. All that is part of the hyperactive presentation. It's interesting. I worked with a teenager in a local school here in Lakewood who was ADHD with hyperactive, actually combined presentation, and he was a literal wall climber. Like he would, in the hallway of his school, he would climb the walls, slide aside a ceiling tile and hang out in the ceiling. So that would be a classic hyperactive. And then there's the combined type, which are people, children or adults who have both. Interesting to note that in childhood, females tend to present more with the inattentive, which is why they're more frequently missed, because those are the kids who are in the back of the classroom. They're not really bothering anyone. They're just kind of spacing out in their own world, dreaming, and not really thriving, but they're not a behavioral challenge. And there's nothing necessarily noticeable about them. Just they're a mess. Everything, they're not getting things done. They're not completing their work. They're forgetting their homework at home, etc. And then we kind of miss it. But in adulthood, they catch up, the statistics catch up, and females and males start to closely match. And the reason for that is because as they grow up and reach adulthood, and all of a sudden, if they get married and start to raise a family and they're holding down a job and they're doing laundry and cooking and cleaning and trying to raise children, all of a sudden the executive function deficits start to really get in the way and the symptoms come out, and then we catch it in adulthood. Whereas with boys, you'll see that hyperactive component generally statistically much faster.
Well, yeah. You just mentioned something that I wanted to comment on, but I can't remember what it was. Okay, so that was my
no worries.
That was my ADHD kicking in.
Right. Experiential
ADHD
tonight.
Right. Yeah. What was I saying?
I don't know.
So I do have lots of questions.
Sure.
Talking about children and ADHD, and you see a child who's presenting with the symptoms, let's just say, of attention deficit disorder or ADHD inattentive.
Mhm.
And how, let's start first with how do you diagnose that? What are the questions that I know what it was. The question I wanted to ask you was about executive functioning.
Mhm.
First, even before we do anything, you're using the term executive functioning, but I don't want to take for granted that everybody
Okay.
understands exactly what that is. I know there's different areas of executive function. Can you elaborate on the various areas of executive function and which ones might be more commonly impacted than others?
Okay, so I'll give you just a nice definition of executive function. This came from John Medina. He says executive function is your ability to get things done and not punch someone in the face while you're doing it. So it's really on a simplistic level, executive function is how we get things done. You know, so to speak, the executive of our brain, the frontal lobes, which is the area of the brain which is regulating so many different things, being self-awareness, flexible thinking, organization, working memory.
What's the connection of flexible thinking, self-awareness, and organization? How are they all considered executive functions? Why are they somehow related? Do you have to have like regulation and self-awareness in order to organize?
So it's a good question. There is, to me, my understanding is the connection will be in the frontal lobe area of the brain, right? The frontal lobe area of the brain is your executive, the CEO of your brain. Being able to be a flexible thinker is coming out of the frontal lobes, right? So when you're going to get stuck, you're going to go into lockdown. That's where the area is impacted. Research showed that kids with ADHD have a 3 to 5 year lag in development of the executive function area of the brain. So if they looked at fMRIs and they compared kids with ADHD to kids who don't have ADHD, neurotypical, and they discovered that their brains that area was thinner and less developed. So that impacted their ability to control impulses, to get started on tasks. But if I can back up a second, I just want to give like a little bit of a broad overview of what's going on here, right? Because very often people will come into my office, and this is, I think, the most common misconception about ADHD that I come across almost weekly. Someone will come in and I'll say, listen, my kid has all these problems, but he's not ADHD. So what could it be? And I say, like, how do you know that he's not ADHD? He says, because when he's playing a computer game, he has no trouble focusing, right? And I say, okay.
And he could read a book for 4 hours straight.
4 hours, and you can't interrupt him, and you can't break his attention, and we can call him for supper, and he doesn't come, and he's not going to the bathroom, he's not eating, he's not anything, and he's up the whole night reading, right? So he can't be ADHD because he obviously doesn't have trouble with focus, right? So the truth is, there's no ADHD on an Xbox, right? That's exactly characteristic of someone with ADHD, because ADHD at its core is an interest-based nervous system, which means that we struggle with the ability not to pay attention, but to choose or prioritize what we pay attention to, which means that in the moment, at the point of performance, you have to choose between doing something that's interesting or something that's important, right? So what will happen is invariably is the ADHD brain will get so strongly pulled to what's interesting that they'll time and time and time and time again make the wrong choice. So it's not a question of attention, it's a question of choosing what to pay attention to. And what that leads to is when you finally do find something that you lock into, so now you're locked in. Now people with ADHD can go into a state of hyperfocus where they can focus like nobody else, where everything else disappears because they're locked in. So
my understanding is that they're hyperstimulated. As long as their brain is very, very stimulated,
correct, right? Because
they'll keep focus.
At its core,
anytime they have to do something that's not hyperstimulating, they just can't. It's too.
So tasks that are cognitively challenging, like, I don't know, the boring stuff on your to-do list or anything that involves a spreadsheet, you're going to just procrastinate and choose what's interesting again and again and again, right? Especially like you'll be working on a spreadsheet and then a link will pop up that says, I don't know, if you click here, we're going to give you the secret to being able to focus better at work by 30%. Right? So you're gone for 2 hours in clickbait in something that's interesting, all in the in the duty of trying to focus better. Ari Tuckman, who's a leader in the ADHD field, calls it procrastivities. So procrastivities are when you're doing activities that are are important, but much less important than what's priority, and you're just procrastinating with those activities. So you kind of feel like, hey, I'm getting something done here. Like, it is really important. I had to pay this bill, right? But because you had to pay your phone bill, you pushed aside paying the mortgage on your house, and then you're on the street by the next day.
Got it. Okay, so that's as far as executive function goes. You covered some of them. Let's say something like working memory.
Okay, so working memory is,
First, let's say what working memory is, and
yeah.
briefly.
So working memory is a good one. That's probably one of the biggest that I see
Indicators?
deficits that people with ADHD tend to struggle with is poor working memory. So working memory is really it's the whiteboard of your brain. It's your you know, if you could picture a classroom and a big whiteboard, let's say you have this whiteboard and you're using the whiteboard to write down all the things you have to remember, right? So you're writing, I don't know, you have to pick up the cleaners, drop off your child at daycare, call your uncle to say hi, call the bank to, you know, pay the mortgage bill, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you're filling up this whiteboard with all the tasks that you have to do. And then what happens is eventually the whiteboard gets full, right? So what happens when the whiteboard gets full? So now we need to start erasing things to make room for more data, more things that you have to keep track of, right? That's kind of what working memory is, right? It's your brain's ability to hold multiple pieces of information at one time and being able to manipulate it and work with it. So it's all there. With ADHD, there are two challenges. Number one is that instead of having this big, huge whiteboard in your brain, you got like a Post-it. And not a big Post-it, like a little Post-it. So you can't put that much information at once. In fact, you can put like one thing, maybe two things. And not just that, but they didn't give you permanent markers to write things with. They didn't even give you expo markers. They give you like a little lead pencil, 0.3, you know, like the thin lead pencils. So you're not even writing it very, you know, with a strong imprint in the first place. That's partially because you're not really paying so much attention when you're writing it down. So then what happens is, you know,
that's like putting the keys down and not knowing where you put them constantly.
That's precisely putting the keys down, right? Like, so if you find your keys in the freezer, which happens to people with ADHD, you can find your keys in the freezer, find in the washing machine.
Which is good, by the way, for battery life. But that's
of course. You could find it in a cup of sugar. You can find your keys anywhere because you're not really focusing on where you put them. And then something grabs your attention and you're off to the phone call, or you're doing laundry, or taking out the garbage. And then by the time that you try to think of where your keys are, you never recorded it. And even if you recorded it, you've overwritten that data with something else, which is why people with ADHD, this is like a great test for ADHD, if anyone wants to try this at home. If you're the type of person who takes out the garbage, like a good husband or a good spouse or whatever, and then never puts another garbage bag in when you come back, then there's a decent chance we should have a discussion. Because the reason is, by the time you've taken out the garbage, you've completely forgotten that there is a garbage can in your kitchen. And by the way, Murphy's Law is your spouse is going to then walk over with, like, you know, the leftover soup and pour it into the garbage can without the bag. And
so we might have to talk after the show.
Okay.
And
that's a whole different discussion. But
if your spouse pours soup in the garbage can, we might have to talk too.
Right. Well, that's split pee. One more is phone calls are classic. So you'll be on the phone with your wife or your husband or someone important, and then you'll get a click. You'd be like, okay, hold on, honey, I'll be right back. You go to the click, and it's like, hi, you know, it's Heather, you know, trying to sell you a used car warranty, and you get into a discussion with Heather about the car that you don't own, buying the warranty, and 20 minutes later, you go back, you hang up, and then you hear a voice like, hello, 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 and it's your spouse who's now irate and frustrated that you left them on hold for 20 minutes and you forgot that they exist. Mm-hmm. The reason you forgot that they exist is because on your little Post-it, you went somewhere else and you had written down talking to spouse, and then you overwrote that with talking to Heather and completely forgot that the spouse is there. So that's one of the big struggles of ADHD. Working memory is huge.
Amazing.
That's what I was saying. I'm kidding.
That's the impact on relationships that you were discussing earlier. This is one of the impacts on relationships.
Right. Working memory has
your spouse might feel like you don't care about me, and in reality, what's happening is I just don't have the capacity to hold that information.
Right. And that would be classic, right? So classic in an ADHD relationship, in a marriage or a romantic relationship, what will happen is almost predictably, a few things we can predict. One is that there's a pretty solid chance that someone with ADHD is going to enter a relationship or marry someone with a super strong executive function. Not always, sometimes you could have both spouses with ADHD, but they're pretty solid chance.
Is that a statistic? Is that a true study?
It's anecdotal, but I don't know if there are studies out there, but it's just about everyone I've met. I wouldn't make up research on this show, so I'm pretty sure it's anecdotal. But it makes sense in logic, and the reason is because someone with ADHD is going to be attracted to the person who has that strong executive function, and the person with a strong executive function, unfortunately, is going to be attracted to someone who's exciting and fun and creative and alive, because perhaps that's something that they're lacking. Now, what happens in that relationship is, think about this: they get engaged, or they meet each other, and the spouse with ADHD is the greatest groom or bride in the history of marriage. And they're lavishing enormous attention and fun and exciting. They'll have the best proposal ever. He's going to get the best jewelry, and then they get married. And there's like a concept I call like the tragedy of the lost princess, because what happens is, remember, ADHD brain is interest based, right? So in the beginning, when it's fun and exciting, there's a strong hyper focus. You're hyper focusing on your spouse. And it's really exciting, it's really fun, and it's really interesting. But then, reality hits, and you're back at work, and now we have laundry to do, and we have a house to keep clean, and socks to take up from the floor, and they're piling up, etc. And then you kind of start to lose interest. It's not as fun, it's not as exciting. The next new exciting fun thing comes up, and then the spouse feels abandoned and just kind of like lost, and like, what happened? And if there's no awareness of this dynamic and of this relationship, what generally tends to happen next is that because the spouse with ADHD is all the fun, and the spouse who's not ADHD is all executive function, right? So what happens to the house and raising the children? Well, everything falls on the spouse who does not have ADHD, who becomes resentful, because now everything's falling on, let's call it, her shoulders, right? And so no one's paying attention to her anymore. The other spouse isn't pulling his weight. And then when the kids start to get older, all of a sudden it's like, daddy is the fun one, and mommy is the party pooper, right? Because she's the one who's trying to get the house cleaned and the chores done, and getting everyone to do their laundry, and to fold your piles and bring your piles to your bed and all that. And the spouse with ADHD is gallivanting around the home, blaring music and making a party. So the lack of awareness could be really devastating to the relationship. Now, one more key point is that the spouse without ADHD, like you said, Maish, is going to feel like, you don't care about me anymore. You don't pay attention to me anymore. I'm not important to you. Your friends are more important to you.
And there's going to be tons of evidence from circumstances and situations that happen, such as the one on the telephone, where I forgot, I didn't pay attention, I committed to something but didn't do it. I left the garbage bag, out, and so obviously you don't care that much about me if you're doing all this stuff.
Yes, and then we get into the next dynamic, which is the parent-child dynamic, because all of a sudden now, how is this the non-ADHD spouse getting her spouse or his spouse with ADHD to pull their weight? By nagging, right? And nagging and nagging and nagging. Remember to pick up the cleaners. Okay, remember to pick up the cleaners. Okay, you're leaving work now. Okay, remember to pick up the cleaners. Text, pick up the cleaners. Honey, did you pick up the cleaners? Like, stop it already, right? So because that spouse turns into a nag, it's the only way to get something done, right? And just nagging and nagging and nagging. And the other spouse feels like, what is this? It becomes a parent-child relationship, right? Where the non-ADHD spouse is the parent and the ADHD spouse becomes the child. And now we have a really unhealthy dynamic, and there's no space for intimacy between a parent and a child, right? So now we have another whole challenge that's coming into the relationship, which is why it's critical for, in my opinion, for marriage therapists to have this understanding and awareness of the ADHD brain, because when that's in place, so then now we can make meaning to it. And now we're halfway there, because you can understand that maybe he or she does care and just can't. It's not that they won't, it's that they can't, right? Beautiful. And that's an impossible concept to wrap your head around if you don't have ADHD.
Yeah, this is great. And I want to just mention, for those of you who are not aware yet, I recently started a new course that that's for newlywed couples. And in this course, which again you're gonna hear more about, we already ran one segment, so we already had our first series, and hopefully we're going to redo this on a bigger scale, larger scale. But in this class, one of the things that I do is experientially have couples share with each other what I call mutual understanding, so that they can start to say, I want you to understand that when deficit A, if they fill in the blank, happens, when I forget about you, or when I raise my voice at you, or when I whatever it is at you, it doesn't mean that I don't care about you or respect you or love you. What it does mean is that I was triggered by X, Y, and Z, or that I had a hard day, or that I'm getting excitable, and they actually share this directly with each other, so that it creates a sort of safety and mutual understanding, and becomes less threatening as far as whether you care about me or not. So that's something that, again, you'll hear more about. I want to just take a question from Henny. Henny, I just unmuted you before, and we had some feedback. Let's see if we can do this. If you can unmute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, but
Hi,
we're hearing
yeah,
our voices back. So we're gonna have to. And I wonder if you want to log out and log back in. Try that.
Mike, it's like the radio back in the old days. Like when you pulled
Remember
in
that?
and your radio's up, and they're like,
Could you
"Oh,
turn down your
turn
radio?
down the radio."
Okay. Okay. Lots more questions. If anybody else has questions, please raise your hand. But I have lots and lots of questions for you. Help.
Go ahead.
I don't know how we're going to do this all in the next
You were
45
gonna ask me about co-occurring disorders? No.
No, I want to ask you a question about, I want to start with a question, differential between, there's some differential diagnoses that I'd like to ask you about. The first is anxiety. So, with children with the hyperactive manifestation of ADD, ADHD, we often find people who are jittery, kids who are jumpy, who are unsettled, and with children who have anxiety, that's one of the manifestations of anxiety too. So you can see the exact same presentation.
Yeah.
And with one child, it's anxiety, and one child, it's ADHD. If you'll ask the teachers from first grade through fifth grade, they'll all say, this kid has ADHD, because teachers are not experts in ADHD necessarily, but they do know what a jumpy kid looks like. So how do you determine, as an expert, analyzing, scrutinizing a child, how do you determine if this is anxiety or ADHD?
So this is a great question. It comes to a bigger question. So step one is just like some statistics on co-occurring disorders, because if a kid has anxiety, first of all, there is a 60% rate of co-occurring disorders, of comorbidities. So that means that, and I've heard recently higher numbers from Russell Barkley. That means that when someone has ADHD, it would be almost reckless to say, okay, he's ADHD, and not consider what else this person might be experiencing or might be struggling with. For example, anxiety has a co-occurring rate of 34%. Depression is 29%. ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, is 60%, and learning disabilities are 25 to 50%. So in order to figure out, is this ADHD? Is it organic ADHD? Is it anxiety? Is it anxiety that's driven by ADHD? Is it ADHD and anxiety? You need a really solid differential diagnosis and a good assessment. A thorough assessment is going to look at multiple factors. It's going to look at presenting problems at school and at home. It's going to look at medical trauma, stressors, what's going on in life, developmental, physical impairments, what medications may have side effects, growth development, eating, sleeping, sleep disorders can be misdiagnosed as ADHD, learning issues, the autism spectrum, depression, etc., reviewing past evaluation. So like a thorough diagnosis is going to really help tease out what this is and really what's driving it. On a simplistic level, I think that anxiety is more, you'll find, is more driven by worry, and ADHD is more driven by a impulsivity or a restlessness. Also important to look out for a sensory processing disorder, because kids with ADHD very, very frequently have a struggle with sensory issues, and very often the kid who's hyperactive and fidgety, it may not even be organic ADHD. It may be a sensory issue, or it may be a sensory issue that comes along with ADHD.
And so what are some of the telltale signs? Like if you're looking to differentiate, like almost virtually every symptom of ADHD can be tied to anxiety as well. What are some of the telltale signs that would say, no, this is really an attention deficit? Not because if I have anxiety, it's going to close down my prefrontal cortex. I'm not going to be able to focus. It's going to make me jittery because I have to be on fight or flight. You know, my adrenaline's pumping. I mean, what are some of the telltale?
So you're going to love this one. I'm going to pay a little bit of attention to cognition and try to understand, you know, is this worry driven? Is there something that's making you nervous? Or is it just that you're feeling overwhelmed because of the executive function deficits? So it will come through, you know, some reading scales, which which we would have the teacher fill out, you know, relevant teachers fill out, parents, the child himself at a specific age, and also a semi-structured interview, just like taking a sense of the history, what else has been going on, so that you can get to, is this really just a, you know, anxiety on its own that's masquerading as ADHD. Very often people who, you know, with sleep disorders get misdiagnosed as ADHD, and we're like, okay, let's put them on a stimulant. And then when you start asking questions and you discover that, you know, they're really not sleeping at night. And when you don't sleep, executive function, you know, there's a double whammy of that ADHD makes it harder to sleep, makes it harder to diet, and makes it harder to exercise. And at the same time, poorly managed sleep, diet, and exercise makes everything harder. So you're stuck in that double bind.
Okay. I'm sorry, I just tried to get Henny back on, but we're having the same problem.
We can go to Dr. Felt.
Huh? All right, so let's take some
patiently and not impulsively.
Nachi Felt, go ahead. Nice to have you here. I don't know if you've ever been on here before, but
Dr. Felt, please ask an easy question.
I was very attracted to hear the expert Dovid Becker present on ADHD, and I'm so glad that you brought up this idea of ADHD informed marriage therapy. Could I trouble you to just elaborate a little bit more? Like, what could be some potential dangers, let's say, of a very highly trained, sincere, enthusiastic, and even very effective marriage therapist who just isn't necessarily, I guess, neurodiverse,
aware,
attuned?
Yeah, I just like, what could go wrong? I'm saying, like, they know the science of marriage therapy. What could go wrong? Like, hello.
Okay, so Dr. Felt, first of all, you know more about this than I do. So if you'd like, you can answer the question, or you could just tell me if what I'm saying makes sense to you. The way I see it is, like, you'll have a couple that's coming in, you know, let's say to a Gottman therapist, and Gottman therapy is phenomenal. It's powerful. It's incredible. You know, and they're working through communication. And, you know, the therapist is working with them, and, you know, the 4 horsemen and the apocalypse is here, and they're working through it, and there's no more contemptuousness, and et cetera. And like, they come back the next week and they're still at war. And it's because perhaps the therapist missed, you know, the core issue in the relationship, which is driving all the negativity and all the negative behaviors, and really what's underlying, and maybe a lot of the reason why there's no, you know, follow through between sessions, and you know, everything that he or she is saying is not being acted upon, and is missing the deeper issue that's driving the whole rift in the relationship in the first place. Does that make sense? What would you say?
I like it. I'm remembering that earlier you were saying that a lot of, like, marriage therapist approaches to just throw medicine at them and say, all right, so here, you know, husband, you take meds, then come back, which makes me wonder, do marriage therapists view the ADHD as the problem, or is there the dynamic the issue? I just want to know, like, what you think is helpful for people to know, like, if you're on the show and you're like worried.
Question. So if there's any marriage therapists on here who can answer that, then you know, I wouldn't speak for them. But what I've seen happen is if, you know, sometimes, like, not typically, hopefully, but in some cases, it's like, you know, at some point the therapist discovers that one of the spouses is ADHD, and if he or she isn't really, you know, developed a thorough awareness and understanding of it and the dynamic it plays on the relationship, he or she might say, like, why don't you consider medication, right? And perhaps medication will help a little bit. Perhaps if the client follows through and gets the medication, and if happens to get the right medication that works right on the first day, so that he or she doesn't give up on the medication an hour later and say like, oh, it doesn't work for me, it makes me dizzy, it makes me nauseous, etc. So then maybe perhaps things might get a little bit better. But if we're not working on for example, like with the our garbage illustration, if we're not addressing what's going wrong in this moment at that point of performance, and what does it mean, and what's underlying, and how could we strategize and problem solve? How can we divide the labor in this house in a way that will work for the spouse with ADHD, so that he or she can start pulling his weight or her weight? And how can he or she kind of hack their brain to be able to deliver what the spouse needs, right? So if this, if the dynamic is such that forgetting an anniversary or forgetting a birthday, which the spouse with ADHD is probably pretty likely to do every single year for 60 years or et cetera. So with ADHD informed treatment, number one, we could help the other spouse understand why this is happening, and then we can try to figure out a way to deal with it. Right. So number one is, there's the acceptance piece, which is huge, which is going to lead to the change piece, which is, okay, I understand it, I get it, but now what am I going to do about it? Like, how are we going to make this work in a way that's great for both of us? I will tell you that in the families and couples and families that figured this out, that did the work and worked through it, the relationships are beautiful, because both spouses are bringing incredible things to the table, right? One spouse has that strong executive function, if that's the case, and the other spouse is bringing the fun, the creativity, the excitement, and they're going to have an amazing family as soon as they can find that groove and that balance, and their relationship is going to be deep, strong, and lasting. But it's work to get there, and you need someone who's going to really understand it and be able to bring you to that space.
Got it. That's super helpful. Meaning it's not so much about equity, it's more about efficiency, like making this work.
Yes.
Awesome.
And both. But yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's take a question
Thank
from
you.
Chaim. Go ahead, Chaim.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between ADHD and substance abuse / addiction, and sort of if there's a specific angle to attack that relationship, prevent it.
Okay. So I think someone actually posted in the chat earlier, people with ADHD are at a much higher rate of susceptibility to substance use and addiction, and that really makes sense. It has a lot to do with poor impulse control, right? A point of performance issue of making lots of bad decisions in the moment, and also that constant need for stimulation, which really is leads right into an addiction. So if someone gets to the space of addiction, I don't know if I have a lot on how treatment would look differently. I think my sense is that you'd have to treat them, the addiction, and work through the ADHD, so that you have that circle of care that's going to bring the client forward. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, I'm not coming with any research background on this really, but I was just wondering.
Do you work in the field of addictions?
Not yet.
Okay.
But I was wondering if there was a sort of a specific way to deal with ADHD, meaning there's something about the ADHD, what a person with ADHD is naturally lacking or looking for that makes them.
Oh, on a preventative measure.
Right. So in terms of a person developing healthier behaviors to prevent that.
Okay, sure. So number one is I desperately love to catch it early. I know that if you look at the statistics of just even life expectancy, if we don't treat ADHD properly, then life expectancy goes down by somewhere between put it this way, the smallest number I've heard is 13 years, which means that someone with untreated ADHD is likely to die 13 years earlier than average. And that makes sense. It's because the person with ADHD who struggles with impulsivity is not going to take care of his health. He's not going to get the colonoscopy when he's supposed to. He's not going to take the cholesterol medication. Much more likely to get into an accident, a car accident, or something like that. And in general, is going to behave in a riskier way. That's just life expectancy. The chance of a relationship blowing up, someone with ADHD going through a divorce, is double. You're twice as likely to get divorced. You're going to make less money on average, and have less job satisfaction, job performance, and a whole host of other issues, including medical, and much more susceptible to addiction. So as a society, I think the more awareness and education we have, the more likely it is that we can catch it younger and treat it younger, and then not be in a space where you fall into risk behaviors such as substances in the first place.
Okay.
So, okay.
Thank you for that. Let's take a question from Shimon. We have so much more to cover. Help. Shimon,
Hi,
go.
Shimon. How are you?
Quickly, let's keep it brief and let's move on.
Hi, how are you? First of all, it's very nice to have you here. Thank you very much. Reminding me from the old times, being in school.
Absolutely.
In any case, I feel like we jumped. I feel like in the ADHD environment, we started talking about treating ADHD, and I think the last sentence you just mentioned about the earlier you start treating it, the better. So we started talking about couples immediately. I think there's so much to do with kids and so much to mention about it, how to treat and how they should be raised, and what not to do, that you can prevent a lot. I think when they get older, if they were raised normally and they were treated and they had the opportunity to grow with their issues and everything, I think that most of the problems are going to be prevented. I think so.
Yes. Yeah, 1,000%. I think that the more awareness we could bring to the issue, the more we can help kids.
I also think that the ADHD is not a secret. It's not something you figure out when they're 13. I think when they're first graders, you know about it.
If they're hyperactive sometimes, but inattentive, not as easily, and even hyperactive. I have lots of kids that don't get caught until they're in 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, sometimes even high school.
But I think something that Moshe Norman mentioned before, he asked about anxiety. I think a lot of these kids, if you don't give them the opportunity, you rather push them back, then it creates anxiety. That's what
100%, because overwhelm creates anxiety, and if you're struggling, it creates anxiety, for sure. Hillary Clinton said it takes a village to raise a child, and so I adapted that saying it takes a planet to raise a child with ADHD, because really we have to build a scaffolding around them so that we can support them. And the scaffolding means, it could be medication, therapy, behavioral treatment, environmental modifications in school. There are so many things that we can do on so many sides to help hold this child.
Parenting.
For sure, parenting, yes. And if any one of those pieces is missing, then we've created a place where the child can fall down. But if we can keep the scaffolding up, I believe that if we can get them through elementary school and high school with their sense of self intact, feeling like a productive member of society with low risk behaviors, feeling confident, then the sky's the limit. Because on the flip side of ADHD are incredible strengths, which is why so many adults with ADHD are actually highly successful, and are running large businesses, corporations, and they're.
Forgot to mention this before. I was going to say it, that
Yeah.
the ADHD people can achieve
right.
100 times more than the usual.
Shimon, but if we don't do this, right, and we don't get them through elementary school and high school, so then they're broken adults, right? I think as Frederick Douglass said, it's far easier
if they reach to that point. A lot of times they're ready dropping.
Right. Rates of suicide are much higher. Also, unfortunately, as Frederick Douglass said, it's far easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And that's true. If we don't catch this in childhood, by the time we catch it as an adult, they're broken men, right? These are people who have no sense of self, who don't believe in themselves, who have all sorts of issues that have developed along the way. Yeah, absolutely. The more,
David, so let's
Go
jump
ahead.
into kids. One of the questions we had tonight, planned for tonight was why some adults with ADHD are so super successful and some are completely and utterly dysfunctional. But I think we're going to hold on that, see if we have time later. But the other one is let's really look at children with ADHD, accommodations. What's the work with them? I want to put aside, I'm assuming that, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming that psychotherapy or emotional therapy is not necessarily a necessity for kids with ADHD unless they're struggling with the repercussions of, having been beaten down and failing and all that stuff that creates those, like you said, or at least correlates with the comorbidities of anxiety / depression and mood issues. But what are some tools, accommodations that therapists, teachers, school faculty, parents must know in terms of working with children, whether is it predominantly to help their executive functioning? Is it predominantly to demonstrate acceptance and show them that we understand? What exactly is it that we want to do to really make a king out of this prince?
I would say, first of all of the above. The understanding and awareness is paramount, right? Because an educator or a teacher, Ross Greene said, children will do well if they can, right? And if they can't, it's because they're lagging in the skills to meet the challenges of the environment, which has never been truer than with a kid with ADHD, right? So, understanding the difference between understanding the point of performance struggle, understanding that it's not that they won't, it's that they can't, and really wrapping your head around it changes entirely the dynamic of the relationship between educator and child, right? So that's step one. Step one is belief. I believe in you. I understand you, and I can see you as a valid member of society, a productive member of society, a healthy person, normal. Once you've got that in place, right, which can be done because so many teachers, when you explain it to them, the light goes on. They go, oh, okay, he's not being difficult because he's trying to get me, or he's not being difficult because he wants to destroy me or ruin my classroom or undermine my authority. He's being difficult because he can't, right? So that's step one. Once we're there, then we can work on environmental modifications that will work better for the ADHD brain. So remember, the ADHD brain is interest-based nervous system. Interest-based nervous system means that you can focus on, you'll always be drawn to things that are one of the following: either something that's interesting, exciting, new or novel, competitive, challenging, or urgent, right? So if it's interesting, exciting, new or novel, competitive, challenge, or urgent, then it will attract your attention and you'll be able to get engaged with it. Kids with ADHD, when they can engage, the sky's the limit. They can do anything. The term that I heard from Dr. Bill Dodson is omnipotential. They're almost like godlike. They can accomplish anything because they're determined and they're creative, right? They're linear thinkers. They're able to, work with lots of information at once, a lot of channels going on. They think out of the box. There's so much power, passion, and good if we can get to it. So how are we modifying the environment? Just some basics. Number one is, now that I know the secret, right? I have the secret that I know if something's interesting for them, challenging or competitive or urgent, then they can engage with that. Okay, so now I know as a teacher, if I can make something interesting, exciting, visual, fun, it's going to work. If I can help them externalize their executive function by bringing in artificial reinforcers, such as incentives done right, not the standard, but incentives that are made designed for a brain with ADHD, I can change things. If I can help reshift their environment to be less distracting, and sort of like black out the distractions, I'm in a much better space. There's a concept in ADHD called preferential seating, right? And no two brains with ADHD are the same, which is what makes it so much fun to treat, because it's really getting to the challenge of what is going on for this kid, what's going to work for this kid.
So you mean some kid might need to sit in the back of the classroom and some kid might need to be in front.
Exactly. So conventional wisdom says, take the kid with ADHD and put him right in front of the teacher, right? And it kind of logically makes sense because the kid with ADHD is sitting right in front of the teacher, right? All the kids behind him aren't distracting him. because they're behind him, right? And now the teacher can pay close attention. But what happens if the fact that the kid with ADHD is sitting there fidgeting and doodling and moving around is driving the teacher crazy. So now the teacher is getting emotionally dysregulated because the kid with ADHD is driving crazy. And now we have a rift in the relationship, and the teacher is snapping at the kid, and the kid with ADHD is getting insulted because of rejection sensitivity, which you didn't even talk about yet, but please make sure we do. And then next thing you know, we have a blow up. So that kid might do better in the back of the classroom, right? I definitely don't. I would definitely want to surround him with all the positive role models and quieter kids, because if you decide to make a ADHD cohort in your back corner, you're going to have a really exciting and loud back corner that's going to overpower the whole classroom. So those are simple things you can do. I don't want to put a kid with ADHD near something that could be distracting, near a window, near air conditioning. I want to give them visual cues and reminders, because remember, if they have poor working memory, there's no way they're ever remembering what they're supposed to be doing when, or the rules of the classroom. But guess what? If they have a paper on their desk that has the 3 simple rules of the classroom, and you have a tap system or a way to signal them or to remind them, and there's like an incentive card, and there's a way for them to remember, kaboom, right? Now, all of a sudden I have a different kid, right? I built a positive structure and an artificial way to reinforce their behavior, and next thing you know, they're doing well and better and better and better, and the relationship with the child and the teacher is amazing. And when that happens, they'll do anything in the world because it's interesting and it's exciting and it's fun.
Great point. Okay, rejection sensitivity is going to stay on the back burner, on the front burner. But before that, let's go to Zalman. We have lots of people with questions. David, are you a good resource for some of these other ideas to keep kids stimulated in the classroom, or other ideas for children at home in terms of executive function and things like that?
You want me to share a good resource?
Are you a good resource for that? If people want to reach out to
Sure,
you,
absolutely.
you
Absolutely.
do have those details? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anybody wants to reach out to
I have
David?
some good handouts on it. So yeah, if anyone wants, you could.
Go ahead, Zalman.
I'm happy to share.
Moshe asked you this question earlier, and first of all, hi, Professor. It's nice hearing from you again.
Likewise.
Back to memories. Thanks. So Moshe asked you earlier, and I want to ask if you could elaborate a little bit. He was asking about diagnosing a child if they have distractions due to anxiety or due to the ADHD, and you said, well, it's dependent on, is distraction anxiety driven or impulse driven, but you didn't elaborate. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, just to clarify? It doesn't.
Okay, so let's say I have a kid, I don't know, he's 11 years old and he's fidgety in class, right? Like a very simple example, and I'm going to take a look at, first of all, let's look at the history, right? Has he always been fidgety in class? Is there something here? Is there something different now? Is it ADHD is chronic, right? So if it's new, then I'm going to look for something situational. I'm going to ask the kid, like I'll go in the interview, hey, what's going on for you? Why are you fidgeting? Is it that just he doesn't know? He's just like his body has so much energy and he can't stop. Or is it that because he's worrying that the teacher might call on him and it's making him anxious, or because he's struggling with a bullying issue and the kid next to him is bothering him, or because someone in his family is sick and he's worrying about that. So just like on a simplistic level, there's going to be differences in the presentation, and the implications are important for treatment, right? Because if I diagnose a kid with ADHD who really has anxiety and put him on a stimulant, it probably won't help much. And in fact, it might make the anxiety worse. Or if I treat ADHD as anxiety, then it's not going to help much either. And if I'm missing a learning disability and I'm not realizing that he's not really understanding what the teacher is telling him or her, or is getting overloaded by the information, or it's a sensory issue, and like he's just feeling overwhelmed in that space because I don't know, they just painted and the smell of the paint is making him so tense and anxious and fidgety that he can't sit still and can't concentrate. That's kind of like a lot of the differences in nuances and what will come up in a kind of in a semi-structured interview and history, and getting a sense from the teachers, from the parents, from what's going on for this kid, what's the history been, and what else. ADHD is a rule out disorder, right? So I really want to rule out everything else so that I can know, okay, this is most likely ADHD, or it's a little different.
Someone with severe trauma. So could they just be that they can't focus because of their?
Yeah. So
one of the differentials is dissociation. I mean, that was another question I was going to ask about dissociation. We've had some experts on dissociation, and it certainly can look like attention deficit disorder.
Yeah.
10th type when a child is just kind of going into his own world. We don't know that that's ADHD.
Right, as could PTSD, right, and traumatic brain injury as well. Like traumatic brain injury sometimes could mimic the symptoms of ADHD, and if you're not aware of that, you might just think that someone has ADHD and be missing that critical point.
And would a stimulant help such a person? Like if a person's taking a stimulant, severely traumatized with a stimulant, and they say the stimulant is helping me focus, does that show you that, well, there is some ADHD going on?
I don't think, I'm not sure if this answers your question, Zalman, but I don't think you can diagnose by stimulant. Like, I don't think you could say necessarily that, like, okay, if a stimulant is helping me focus, that means that I must be ADHD, because I think stimulants can help everyone focus, and that's why on college campuses they're struggling mightily with many students who are trying to obtain an ADHD diagnosis so that they can obtain stimulants so that they can do better on their tests and study better. You missed out, Salman. but that's really what's happening. So yeah, I don't think you could diagnose by stimulant. I think you need a good differential diagnosis.
Okay. Let's take a question from Elliot Kaplan. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. My question is, has there been any research on any correlation between screen time and video games to correlate with ADHD?
In what sense?
The kids that are more stuck on the video screen somehow, they can focus on the video screen, but once they have to get away from the video screen, they kind of lose it because they don't know where to focus now.
Right. So I don't know of any research that I can quote to you off the top of my head. I do know that in the understanding of the interest-based nervous system, it makes perfect sense, because when you're on the video game, there's no ADHD on an Xbox, right? You can focus better than anyone else, right? If a kid with ADHD is playing a video game, right, and his or her mother tries to call him or her for supper, there's no hope. It's just like, it's supper. There's nobody home. Whereas when the environment is less stimulating, there's no greater stimulation than a screen. But I don't know of any specific research. Dr. Felt might know.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I was just looking for if there was research. So you're saying that
Right.
you're not
Okay.
aware. Yeah.
I was scared you would ask something about paradoxical interventions, and then like I'd have to kick it back to my sheet.
That'll be the next.
Next question.
Paradoxical treatment for ADHD.
Okay, let's take a question from Yossi. Yossi, go ahead.
Hi, Yossi.
Hi. Hi, David.
How are you?
Okay. Sorry. I got onto the next train of thought, and I guess maybe my ADHD kicked in. No. Okay. I remember what I wanted to ask. Like Rabbi Steiner said, we see in the classroom often that we can identify or at least suspect ADHD as early as perhaps first or second grade.
Right.
Yet it often takes until 6th or 7th grade until we can convince the parent and to pursue, any form of therapy. That there is a great reluctance, both on the part of school administrations, on the part of Rebbeim, and on the part of parents, to point to ADHD. If a teacher points or Rebbe points to ADHD, they look at the Rebbe as, oh, so you can't handle it, so you just want to label my child. So Rebbe is very reluctant to make that suggestion. An administration, they don't want to be coming to the parent and telling them that. And it's only at the point where the school really can't handle it anymore that they'll actually broach the subject with the parent. What do you suggest? How would it be appropriate to bring this up and to screen for that?
Exactly.
Sorry?
It's a great question. I have lots of suggestions. I'll be very brief in answering because I want to get to more, if that's okay. But I think there's a few answers. Number one is it seems to me I do have the opportunity to do some trainings for teachers in elementary school, and I find by and large that they're all extraordinarily receptive and really excited to understand this better and to learn about it so that it impacts their classrooms. I think that schools are not mental health treatment facilities, so I would always suggest that I wouldn't say that anything other than like I would suggest an evaluation. Like, let's understand what's happening, because teachers are frontline workers. and they can tell when this kid is different, right? And like something is here. And when they're able to connect with the parent, and it's important to have a relationship with the parent before that call. So like, great if you can to build a relationship throughout the year, so that when you call, you're just really coming from a non-combative, non-threatening stance. Just really like, this is what I'm noticing, right? Like I'm noticing that your child's struggling with. I'm wondering, does he or she struggle with this at home? And like, what are some things you've done to address it? And then all of a sudden, like the dynamic shifts, because you're not a threat and you're not labeling or diagnosing. You're just trying to help. And then parents are much more receptive to saying like, let's see if we can figure this out, because maybe there's something out there that can be helpful, that can help shift this. And I found that parents are very willing and very ready to explore it. And I think, I think that dynamic is shifting and changing more and more by the day, by the hour, as more and more teachers become aware and trained. And like, I hope that we can continue to bring this to the community and to the broader world at large, because like I said earlier, the earlier we can get kids help, the more likely they are to have an amazing life and good relationships. So it is key.
There's a question that I wonder, I guess this is sort of heresy to ask it, but so many of these things are so difficult to determine. And I know psychiatrists or neurologists are very certain when they give a diagnosis often of ADHD, without necessarily always knowing all the variables, because parents and children will always share the various traumas that may have occurred in the history. Is there any harm done in trying a psychostimulant? So like, maybe I have ADHD, I can't concentrate well. What would happen if I took a stimulant for 3 days? Is there anything so terrible about that, barring any legal, conversation? Yeah, in other words, would that be an indicator? Would it be an indicator? Can I take the stimulant for 3 days? I see it works for me. So who really cares what my diagnosis is?
Agreed. So interesting. A mentor of mine is Dr. Bill Dotson. I mentioned him earlier. He's a prominent psychiatrist out in Denver, and really like one of the leaders in this field, prescribing for probably 30 years. He told me that 90% of his adult patients who came to him for an evaluation came because their child was diagnosed with ADHD and they tried one of their stimulants. And they said, oh my gosh, this is incredible. Like, I didn't even know that my brain could feel this way or do this. And so like they came for an evaluation and they hopefully got treatment. But one thing about stimulant medication is that really there are different classes of stimulants. There are non-stimulants. There are many different ways to treat ADHD pharmacologically, and we don't really know what's going to work for which body. Everyone metabolizes medication differently. So that's critical, because so many times you try, sometimes you'll get that aha effect where it's like you take a stimulant and you're like, wow, this is incredible. And I'm on my 36 milligrams of Concerta for life. Sometimes it happens, but most often it's a trial and error process. So to answer your question, number one is, we mentioned earlier, you can't diagnose by stimulant, but lots of adults do try it and explore. I'm not talking to the safety of doing that. I'm not a prescriber, and I don't want to, I don't want to go there if I can avoid it.
So I think the moral of the story is that if you're not functioning, get your child diagnosed.
That's right. The truth is, if the child has ADHD, then there's a 50% chance that one or both parents do. Right. And that's part of an important key to diagnosis, is to check, to explore the parents and their lives, because if a parent has ADHD, then you're probably looking at an inconsistent parenting style. And an inconsistent parenting style is the opposite of what a kid with ADHD actually needs.
Okay, let's I have a Chaya Appel wants to ask a question, but right before that, I promise that I'm going to remind you
rejection sensitivity,
and I'm trying to not have ADHD. So
okay, so there are two things that really are not in the DSM as being components of ADHD that are seem to be very, very strongly at least correlated. And I'll get into the statistics and the research, but it's emotional regulation and rejection sensitivity. That means people with ADHD struggle often mightily with emotional regulation, And there's the whole ODD component, but rejection sensitivity is huge. It's known as RSD, rejection sensitivity dysphoria. It's a debate in the field if it's organically a component of ADHD or if it developed out of ADHD, but it's really a very, very, very strong aversion to rejection. Way more powerful than a neurotypical person will experience it. And very often clients, adults with ADHD, will describe it, as when they perceive rejection, it's almost like someone punched them in the chest, like a physical, punch in the chest. And if you could think of the impact that has on a marriage, on a job, on parenting. So we're so often the slightest, most innocuous thing can make them feel so hurt. And then the reaction blows. So that's key. I would just mention, parenthetically, there are some prescribers who believe that prescribing alpha agonists, such as Intuitive, can really help dial down rejection sensitivity. So if someone really experiences that strongly, there are sometimes ways that we could treat it pharmacologically, but again, it's not fully accepted. I don't believe in the field, but rejection sensitivity is huge, as is emotional regulation challenges. So
they sound very related.
It comes up in marriage. It comes up in childhood, with peer relationships, with teacher relationships. You feel like your teacher is slightly rejecting of you, and all of a sudden the kid is exploding and going off the handle.
Amazing. Chaya, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much. I had a question. I know we spoke a lot about children, and earlier we were talking about adults. I'm curious, if you have clients coming in, successful adults, they're succeeding at work, at home, they're definitely struggling at some points in their executive functioning.
Right.
And what's the way forward in treatment for adults when you're looking at, I know a lot of medication, but then what else you'd like to be more holistic approach?
I'm happy you brought it up because I think it's important. Very often, right now, I think, again, this is anecdotal, but I think that we're looking at adults in their upper 20s, 30s, and low 40s that are of the age where they weren't diagnosed with ADHD, even though they should have been. ADHD, of course, exists on a spectrum, which means that there are people with significant and severe symptoms that are really impairing their functioning and on a daily basis, and there are people with lighter symptoms that are the impairments are not as pronounced. We do know pretty definitively that ADHD is with you across the lifespan, just that the symptoms will wax and wane in adulthood depending on the challenges of your environment. So when you're in a space where things are really overwhelming and you're balancing 3 jobs and 5 children and whatever, then those symptoms are going to come out much more pronounced and much stronger. So when it comes to treatment, there are multiple layers of treatment. We talked about a scaffolding for children. There are also many different ways to treat ADHD as an adult. So number one would be through medication. The research shows that medication balanced with behavior treatment or therapy is going to give you the most effective 1-2 punch. Most likely,
are there people who can function without the medication? I mean,
1000%.
That can learn to function without the medication.
Yeah, so there are many people who are doing extraordinarily well. They have ADHD and they figured it out, and they don't need treatment, and perhaps they never did, right? Because they learned how to hack their brain, and they learned how to make ADHD work for them, right? Hyperfocus can be an incredibly powerful tool in a business, right? If you're the type of guy who is going to be able to figure out challenges and solve problems in ways that no one else can, and deliver a product and come up with ideas and strategies, as long as you're in a job that works for your brain, right? If you're an accountant and you find numbers boring, it's going to be death by numbers. If you're in a creative field, that's fun. Not that you can't be an accountant. Some people love it, and some people love computer programming. But if it's something that's working for your brain, it's great. Very often, what I find is, I've spoken with many business leaders, CEOs, developers who are clearly have ADHD and are highly successful. And very often I found that they're outsourcing executive function. So you'll have the leader of a corporation organization who has a team surrounding him or her that's really filling in all those executive function deficits. Like they'll have a team of secretaries or executive assistants or personal assistants who are handling their scheduling, who are handling their follow-ups, their meetings, their phone calls, and all of a sudden they're freed up to focus on things that they're good at, because they're not stuck with things that they're not good at. Now, they may have challenges in their personal relationships at home, so if there are many different areas of struggle, but
Does that matter? As long
adults
as they're wealthy, it doesn't matter, right?
that's the beginning of the solution. But there's an entire field of coaching, which is like, let's back up a step. Number one is like, let's understand what's going on with this adult. What are the co-occurring disorders? Because we'll have to treat those through therapy, right? If someone has anxiety and we miss it because we're completely focused on ADHD, or struggling with their relationships, or whatever else it is, and very often adults with ADHD need help, even if all they have is ADHD. They need therapy, right? Because of their life experiences, because of what the impact on their sense of self and their relationships. But there's also a whole nother field of executive function coaches who if they're and some of them are here tonight. I see a few names of really great executive function coaches who work with ADHD, who are amazing at really helping the ADHD brain, right? To develop hacks, to develop a playbook and a system that's going to work for you, because you don't have to try harder, you have to try differently, right? And that's key, because trying harder doesn't work, right? You can try and try and try and try and try and get nowhere, but when you try differently, it does work. So really, coaches can help you with that and bring accountability to the system.
ADHD coach should be a great idea if they can, like you say, hack the brain. I like that term.
1,000%. And I believe that it's an explosive growth field, coaching, because adults with ADHD can get enormous benefit from coaching to help them stay on track, to help them plan, etc. Coaches are not therapists. It's a different field. And if you could do both, it's gold.
David, this was amazing.
Run the world.
And the only problem with it is that we don't really have enough time to cover all the parts that we have to cover, which is a bad thing, but it's also a good thing, because then I can muster up the chutzpah to ask if you'll come again and finish the job.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. You heard it
Thanks
here.
for putting me on the spot.
Okay, so I want to thank everybody for joining. In a couple of weeks, actually, we are having Peg Dawson. Speaking of executive function masters or masterettes, Peg Dawson will be joining us in just a few weeks. You'll get the announcement. And until then, this is Maishi Norman, Mondays with Maishi. Thank you very much, David, for sharing your expertise. Thanks everybody for joining. I am going to